There's a specific kind of empath almost nobody writes about because she doesn't fit the usual portrait. She isn't the one surrounded by people, the one everyone calls their best friend, the one whose phone never stops buzzing with someone needing her warmth, her advice, her endless availability. She's the one who eventually, deliberately, chose solitude, not because she failed at connection, not because something is broken in her, but because she discovered something in the silence that most people spend their entire lives too afraid, too busy, or too distracted to ever find. This is the solitary empath. And the gift she carries, the one she's learned to hold carefully, selectively, is one most people genuinely cannot handle being shown, not because it's dangerous in any conventional sense, but because it reflects something back at them they're rarely prepared to see. Today, we're going to talk about exactly what this gift is, why solitude specifically is what allows it to develop in the first place, and why most people, even well meaning people, even people who genuinely care about her, struggle to actually receive what she's capable of offering once she's done the deep work solitude requires. Let's start with something important to clarify before we go any further, because it changes everything about how you understand this specific empath type. Her solitude was never avoidance. This distinction matters enormously because there's a common, damaging assumption that anyone who withdraws from constant social connection must be doing so out of fear, out of social failure, out of some wound that prevents genuine intimacy. For some people, this assumption holds true, but for the solitary empath we're describing today, something different, something considerably more deliberate, is actually happening. She withdrew at some point, not because people frightened her, but because constant exposure to other people's emotional worlds had left her without enough space to ever discover her own. Remember what we've discussed extensively throughout previous conversations about how empathic absorption actually functions. The way a highly attuned nervous system doesn't simply notice other people's emotions, but genuinely absorbs them, carries them, processes them as though they were partially her own. For someone with this level of sensitivity, constant social immersion doesn't produce connection in the way it might for someone less porous. It produces a kind of permanent noise, a background hum of other people's feelings that never fully quiets long enough for her to hear her own thoughts clearly underneath it. This is why, for this specific type of empath, solitude eventually stops being simply preferred and starts being genuinely necessary, not as an escape from people, but as the only reliable condition under which she can actually access herself. And here's where the gift begins to take shape, because what happens inside genuine, sustained solitude for someone with this particular sensitivity is considerably more significant than simply resting or recharging the way solitude functions for less porous people. In the silence, without the constant background presence of other people's emotional static, something remarkable starts to clarify. She begins to hear the difference, often for the first time in her adult life, between what she actually feels and what she's been absorbing from everyone around her for years. This distinction sounds simple when stated directly, but living it represents one of the most profound psychological developments a person can experience, because it means finally, completely separating her own authentic internal experience from the accumulated emotional residue of a lifetime spent unconsciously carrying everyone else's. This clarification produces something we might call authentic depth, distinct from the more diffuse, reactive depth most empaths carry before doing this specific kind of work. Ordinary empathic depth, the kind that develops simply through sensitivity to other people's emotions, is genuinely valuable, but it remains fundamentally reactive, responding to whatever emotional information happens to be present in her environment at any given moment. Authentic depth, the kind that develops through sustained solitude, is something different, a stable, internally generated wellspring of insight that doesn't depend on external emotional input in order to function. She's no longer simply reflecting what's around her. She's generating something genuinely, distinctly her own. This is the first piece of the forbidden gift, and understanding why it's specifically forbidden, in the sense of being genuinely difficult for most people to receive, requires understanding what this authentic depth actually produces when she eventually does share it with someone. Because here's what happens when the solitary empath speaks. Once she's done this deep internal work, once her insight has become genuinely her own, rather than simply reflective of whatever emotional information happens to be circulating around her, she sees people with a clarity that bypasses the layers of performance, social convenience, and comfortable self-deception most people rely on to function in their daily lives. She's spent enough time completely alone with her own authentic experience that she's developed an almost unbearable sensitivity to the gap between what someone presents and what's actually happening underneath it. A sensitivity most people, even well-intentioned people, have never had to develop because they've never spent enough uninterrupted time with their own unfiltered internal experience to recognize what genuine authenticity actually feels like by contrast. This is precisely why most people struggle to receive what she offers, and it's worth understanding this mechanism directly, because it explains a specific painful pattern the solitary empath often encounters throughout her life. People who initially seek out her insight, her perspective, her apparent wisdom, only to eventually withdraw from her, sometimes with visible discomfort they can't quite articulate, once she's actually offered them something genuine. Think about what it actually requires to receive someone's authentic, unfiltered perception of you. It requires a level of honesty about your own life, your own patterns, your own self-deceptions that most people, understandably, aren't prepared to face on a random Tuesday afternoon in an ordinary conversation that wasn't supposed to become this significant. The solitary empath's insight, precisely because it's developed through genuine internal clarity rather than social performance or diplomatic softening, tends to land with a directness most people simply aren't accustomed to receiving from anyone in their daily lives, family included. Let's go deeper into why this specific discomfort occurs, because understanding it fully reveals something crucial about why this gift has to be held so carefully, offered so selectively, rather than shared freely with everyone who happens to cross her path. Most people move through their daily lives sustained by a network of small, ongoing self-deceptions, not because they're dishonest people, but because full, constant awareness of every uncomfortable truth about oneself and one's choices would be genuinely difficult to function under. The friend who tells herself her marriage is fine, when some part of her already knows it isn't. The colleague who believes his career stagnation is simply bad luck rather than a pattern of avoidance he's never fully examined. The family member who maintains a careful, comfortable story about why a particular relationship ended, one that positions him more favorably than the full truth would allow. These aren't malicious lies. They're protective structures, ones that allow people to keep functioning, keep showing up to their lives, without having to confront everything uncomfortable about their own choices simultaneously. The solitary empath, precisely because her own extended time in silence stripped away her capacity to sustain this same kind of comfortable self-deception about her own life, has an almost involuntary difficulty participating in maintaining other people's versions of these same protective structures. Not because she's actively trying to dismantle them, not because she's judging anyone for needing them, but because her own internal clarity makes it genuinely difficult for her to perform the kind of comfortable agreement, the reassuring validation of a story she can sense isn't quite accurate, that most social interaction actually depends on in order to feel smooth and pleasant. This is precisely what makes her presence feel forbidden to so many people, even though she's rarely doing anything overtly confrontational. Simply being near someone who has done this level of internal work, who carries this specific quality of unflinching self-honesty, tends to activate an uncomfortable awareness of one's own protective structures, even when she says almost nothing directly challenging them. People report feeling around her a strange sense of being gently but unmistakably seen through, even during ordinary, unremarkable conversation, precisely because her own capacity for self-deception has been so thoroughly dismantled by her time in solitude that she's lost much of her ability to participate convincingly in anyone else's. This is why the gift genuinely has to be held selectively, and understanding this necessity requires moving past a common misunderstanding that offering this quality of presence to everyone equally would simply be more generous, more loving, more in keeping with what an empath is supposedly meant to do. This misunderstanding assumes that authenticity is always received as a gift, regardless of whether the person receiving it has any genuine readiness or desire to confront what it surfaces. But authenticity offered to someone who isn't ready for it, who hasn't sought it out, who's simply encountering it in the ordinary course of a casual interaction, rarely functions as a gift at all. It functions instead as a genuine disruption, one that can produce real discomfort, real defensiveness, sometimes genuine harm to relationships and self-concepts the other person wasn't prepared to have challenged in that particular moment. This is precisely why the solitary empath eventually learns, often through painful experience, exactly the kind of careful discernment we've discussed extensively throughout many previous conversations about super empaths and healed empaths more generally. The capacity to distinguish between people genuinely seeking her deeper perception, ready to receive it even when it's uncomfortable, and people who are simply encountering her in passing, unprepared for and undeserving of exactly the kind of unfiltered authenticity that constant, unguarded openness would produce. This discernment often looks, from the outside, remarkably similar to guardedness or social distance, and this appearance frequently produces its own kind of loneliness for the solitary empath, one worth naming directly. She's often misread as cold, aloof, difficult to get close to, precisely because she's learned to withhold her deepest perception from most people, offering instead a pleasant, functional surface that allows for ordinary social connection without requiring either party to confront anything more significant than the moment actually calls for. This surface-level engagement isn't dishonest. It's simply calibrated, deliberately, to match what the relationship and the moment can actually hold, rather than flooding every interaction with the full depth of insight she's capable of offering. This calibration requires enormous, ongoing discernment, and it's worth understanding what actually determines who receives access to her deeper gift versus who receives only the calibrated, protective surface. It's rarely about how much she likes someone in the ordinary sense, and it's almost never about social status, charm, or how immediately impressive someone seems in casual interaction. It's about a specific quality she's learned to detect through her own considerable practice, genuine readiness, evidenced not through anything someone says directly, but through subtler signals, a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than immediately deflecting it, genuine curiosity about their own patterns rather than defensive dismissal of any observation that challenges their comfortable self-narrative, an underlying hunger for truth, even when that truth might initially sting. People who demonstrate this specific readiness, even briefly, even in a single conversation, often find themselves receiving something from her that feels genuinely different from ordinary social interaction, something that stays with them long afterward, precisely because it offered them access to exactly the kind of clarity most of their daily relationships never provide. This is the gift finally being offered rather than withheld, and it's worth understanding what this specific experience actually feels like for someone genuinely ready to receive it, because it reveals something important about why the gift, despite requiring such careful selective offering, remains genuinely, profoundly valuable rather than something that should be permanently hidden away out of fear of how it might land. Because here's what actually happens when the solitary empath's gift lands with someone genuinely ready to receive it. And understanding this reveals why this gift, despite its rarity and despite requiring such careful discernment about when to offer it, remains one of the most valuable things a person can encounter throughout an entire lifetime of otherwise comfortable, surface-level relationships. When someone genuinely open, genuinely curious, genuinely willing to sit with discomfort encounters her authentic perception, something shifts that ordinary relationships almost never provide. They experience, often for the first time in years, the specific relief of being seen completely, without performance, without the careful management most relationships require in order to maintain their comfortable equilibrium. This experience is genuinely rare in most people's lives, precisely because most relationships, even loving ones, involve some degree of mutual protective agreement, an unspoken understanding that certain uncomfortable truths will remain politely unexamined in service of maintaining the relationship's ease. The solitary empath, when she finally offers her genuine perception to someone ready to receive it, breaks this pattern completely, and for the person on the receiving end, this rupture often feels like exactly what they didn't know they were missing. Not comfortable, not always immediately pleasant, but genuinely, significantly clarifying in a way that ordinary relationships, however loving, rarely manage to provide. This is precisely why people who receive this gift once often find themselves returning to her, seeking her out specifically, even when her honesty occasionally stings, because they've discovered something considerably more valuable than comfort: genuine, reliable access to truth about themselves and their lives that they can't reliably find anywhere else. Here's what's crucial to understand about the actual function this gift serves, beyond simply making individual people feel seen in isolated moments. It offers a specific kind of permission most people desperately need, but rarely receive anywhere in their ordinary lives: permission to stop performing, permission to acknowledge the parts of their own experience they've been managing, minimizing, or explaining away, permission to be genuinely, completely known, at least for the duration of that specific interaction, without needing to maintain whatever careful image usually governs how they present themselves to the world. This permission, once experienced, often produces genuine, lasting change in people who receive it. Not because the solitary empath gave them advice or told them what to do, but because her authentic presence created a space where their own genuine self, long buried under years of protective performance, finally had room to surface and be acknowledged, sometimes for the first time in their entire adult lives. This is ultimately why the gift matters so profoundly, despite how carefully it has to be held, despite how much discernment its proper offering requires. It's not simply insight or wisdom in the abstract sense. It's the rare, specific gift of genuine permission to be fully, authentically known, offered by someone whose own extended time in solitude stripped away enough of her own performance that she's capable of recognizing and receiving authenticity in others, rather than requiring, like most people unconsciously do, that everyone around her maintain whatever comfortable performance keeps interaction smooth and undemanding. If you recognize yourself as this specific kind of empath, someone who withdrew not out of fear but out of genuine necessity, someone who's spent significant time in solitude developing a clarity most people never access, someone who's learned, sometimes painfully, that this clarity has to be offered selectively rather than distributed freely to everyone who crosses your path. Understand exactly what you're actually carrying. It's not a burden to apologize for, and it's not evidence that something is wrong with your capacity for connection. It's a genuinely rare gift, one that requires exactly the kind of careful discernment you've likely already developed, about who has genuinely earned access to your deepest perception and who simply needs the calibrated protective surface that allows ordinary interaction to remain smooth and functional. This discernment isn't coldness, despite how it might occasionally be misread by people who wanted easier, less demanding access to what you carry. It's wisdom, hard won through your own considerable time alone, learning exactly what your gift requires in order to be received as the genuine offering it actually is, rather than experienced as an unwelcome intrusion by people who never asked for and weren't prepared to receive it. You don't owe everyone your deepest perception. You don't owe constant availability, constant openness, constant willingness to offer the full depth of what solitude helped you develop, simply because you happen to possess it. What you owe, if you owe anything at all, is careful, honest discernment about who has genuinely earned access to it, and the wisdom to offer your calibrated protective surface to everyone else, without guilt, without apology, without needing to justify why not everyone gets to receive the same depth you're capable of providing. This is what it actually means to carry the forbidden gift of the solitary empath. Not something to hide out of fear, but something to hold with exactly the kind of careful, deliberate reverence any genuinely rare and valuable thing deserves, offered freely to those ready to receive it, protected carefully from those who aren't, and never, ever apologized for, regardless of how many people along the way struggled to understand exactly what they were encountering when they finally, briefly, met the fullness of who you actually are. Thanks for watching.